Morning, Lee.
Good morning, Chris. How are you?
I'm going very well, thanks, all things considered. Um, I don't think we need to uh, use any of the cliches that tend to be part of greeting each other these days and just get straight into business.
Sounds like a plan to me.
So you're talking to a lot of very distressed tech companies at the moment. What do you, what's your sort of opening gambit in terms of the advice you're giving them?
Well, I think the starting point for me is understanding the financial risk, the strategy risk, and operational risk. That's really the three focal points. Um, from a financial perspective, what is our position? What sort of cash do we have? How can we create? Look at our balance sheet, look at the equity position, look at our P&L, and see what sort of working capital we have or potentially don't have. What recurring revenues we might have coming in. What other sources of income may come into that through government subsidies. They're really just trying to understand that cash position,
Mm.
and then looking at the operational expenses. And I guess the fine line there is the balance between, um, you know, keeping the lights on, um, or turning it off altogether. What can you, where can you trim? But I think also in thinking about strategic risk, which feeds into some of that, is where do we need to redirect some of those efforts in both human and financial resources that we're focused on at the moment, which is opening the doors, opening the shop, etc. Um, and I think probably one of the important things, is in times of crisis, and I've been in business through a few of these things now, nothing to this level that we're at now, but it's the thinking of the crisis is first of all the fetal position for the first couple of days. What have we lost? What haven't we got? Where to from here? But I think very quickly you've got to start thinking about, well, what have we actually got? We've got customers, we've got products, we've got access to technologies. We've got to change the way that we do our distribution. There's it's a short question, Chris, but a pretty long answer.
Yeah. No, I 100% concur that the companies I'm working with, I think in many cases we're, zooming out a little bit and looking at a cataclysmic employment environment. So, your company remains your own best option in terms of remaining employed. Um, so at a purely sort of individualistic level, and sort of your near circle of colleagues and friends, their best opportunity to remain employed is in your company. So figuring out a way to survive a kind of nuclear winter is obviously the critical thing, because coming out the other end, it's going to take some time for employment markets to pick up where there might be alternative job opportunities. So keeping these companies alive is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, and I think that's where the idea of you sort of everybody's got to share the load. You know, it can't be left to certain sectors. Where we're seeing the effect on retail at the moment. I think the landlords and the financiers. Everybody's got to share the load on this. And really, optimally, you want to have as many businesses, hunkered down. It's like time. We're going to hunker down, right? We're going to get lean. We're going to get mean. We're going to come up with inventive, creative ways to do that. We're going to think about other ways that we can generate revenue and sell our products online and use social media and the channels that are available to us. I mean, you and I have spoken about this, Chris, in the last week or so. 91, before the advent of the internet, none of this would have been possible. So had this type of event occurred at that stage, we wouldn't have had the option to move to this form of communication and still keep the wheels going. Keep some parts of the economy
Absolutely. You know, we wouldn't be able to order food online. We wouldn't be able to have kids remaining socially connected with their friends via gaming. We wouldn't be able to keep education going. You know, there are so many things that I think equip us better now. I mean, it's still a dreadful situation, but in terms of continuity of some semblance of civilization is possible in a way with technology now that it wouldn't have been, you know, just a decade or two ago.
Well, you know, my mother, my daughter's grandmother, asked how Talia was handling it, you know, with the isolation, etc. And I said, well, you know, she's isolated in the room, you know, connected with people all over the world on a normal basis, so it's business as usual for her. But I think that's where there's also a challenge where people perhaps haven't been used to working from home and remotely, and have been used to going into an environment. And I think the technology thing comes into it as well, where perhaps companies aren't as prepared to go offline with the flexibility of the cloud, enablement of the cloud, to say we can be anywhere, anytime, and all of a sudden we've got you know, technology problems where we're still using you know, on-premise servers, and how do if we do go remote, how do we actually get access to that data to continue to operate the business? That's another problem that I've heard a couple of times last week.
You talked about the financial risk. Let's talk a little bit about the other kind of risk categories that you mentioned there before, sort of strategy risk and the others. Talk a little about strategy risk. What are you advising your mentees with regard to strategy risk?
Well, I think, you know, strategy and risk are inseparable, first of all. Like, they go hand in hand together. You can't have one without the other. You can't talk about one without the other. They're one and the same thing. And there's probably two parts to it. There's the current strategy that we're using to generate our revenue and to operate our business, and what potentially sort of strategy could we move to in that, and then assessing the risk around that, the likelihood of the financial implications of that. Do we have the resources? You know, stress testing that idea that, you know, it sounds like a great idea on paper, but how executable is that given our constraints, etc., taken into that.
Sort of looking at the big pieces of what's happening in the broader economy, you know, collapse of employment, collapse of demand and discretionary spending in the short term. You know, those are obviously things that you can't wish away, can you?
The fact is they're there, so you sort of factor them in. But then I think that's also where you can sort of start to put your thinking towards, well, what are the opportunities that arise out of some of that as well? I think it might have been, was it Albert Einstein said, within adversity lies opportunity. And there is potentially opportunity for businesses to, you know, bring themselves online and start to operate differently, potentially open new channels, open global markets for themselves, take their products and services they've been developed. But I think that's going to take some retooling for a lot of people. And I think that retooling has to happen fairly rapidly.
Yeah. You know, I suppose one of the things I've been saying to companies I'm trying to help is all eyes are on the COVID crisis for the next while, you know, and it's probably the only clear area where you can see capital moving towards, you know, mostly from government, because, you know, there's probably something of a credit crunch at the moment in terms of private investment and markets. And to the extent that you can, are there problems that you could be contributing to solving within the emergency response effort? And that's not possible for everyone, but for a lot of people who are faced with sort of, in some ways, business closure or business shuttering for a period of time, it really does bear some kind of intellectual effort to think about, okay, what could we be doing? What, as you said before, when you do an audit of your capabilities and assets and intellectual property and networks and so forth, could you somehow commandeer those things to make a contribution to the emergency response effort as a way of keeping in business and staying alive and using your team's skills?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, we're seeing that there's already been Qantas employees deployed across to Woolworths and Coles as sort of one of the bigger examples of that. But why couldn't we be doing that on a micro basis as well? That's sort of a particular approach. I think Qantas's example to that, which is to not retrench anyone, but to sort of try and use extended leave and get people to use annual leave and sort of keep. I suppose it is on the assumption, and it's the unknown of, the period of time and the extent. I suppose we're starting to get a better handle on that, I feel. I don't know how you feel about that, but it seems that we're getting a better handle on how long this, is it 6 months, 12 months, 18 months?
Yeah, look, I think, it's such a multi-dimensional problem that I find the only way to kind of intellectualize it in a way where you can get some sort of outcome for yourself is to narrow the problem down somewhat. If you think of it on a global basis, it's mind-boggling because regions and individual countries and so forth are all at a different stage of this journey. We're seeing Western countries, Europe and the US, going through a torrid time right now. But I think we all know that the countries that are going to really cop the brunt of this are going to be the developing nations, where, to put people into, India put 1.3 billion people into lockdown on Tuesday this week. Most of the Indian population lives on a hand-to-mouth basis, need to go out in order to sustain their lives. One wonders how developing countries, being from South Africa, a place where, the majority of people are on the poverty line, living hand to mouth, their existence is fundamentally requires them to go out into the informal economy and so forth. So, when you start thinking about all of those things, it just becomes an insurmountable intellectual challenge to make sense of it. I think the only way you can really do it until we have a little bit of a better picture is to sort of narrow down to, perhaps a regional, national, and then sort of hyper-local level and think about what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my industry? What does this mean for my industry in my sort of domestic environment, and then sort of work your way outwards, as opposed to trying to start out there and come back. It's very, very difficult, I think, to wrap your head around this from a leadership perspective. But, you touched on Qantas just before there, and I think our audience that we're trying to assist here are leaders, business leaders within companies and industries and so forth, and try to provide some useful insights and help to them. Talk a little bit about Alan Joyce, the CEO of Qantas, and what have you liked about what he's done, and how would you sort of describe the Qantas approach? I mean, the airline industry has effectively shut down. How do you, as a CEO of a major, probably Australia's best known brand, huge company employing, huge numbers of people, he must be under an immense amount of pressure. Tell us about his approach. What has impressed you, and what do you think we can learn from that as leaders of smaller businesses?
Well, I think the operational expenditure, the operational exposure you have in times where you've got to shut these down. It's like shutting down a mini miner versus shutting down a road train or a high-speed bullet train. And the size of the footprint of your operations, as you said, the massive scale of that operation, the number of aircraft, the number of people, the regulatory environment they operate in. It's already a tough gig as it is in the airline industry, the cost, the technologies. So I thought that, the idea, the strategy of saying, well, this is temporal. And so we don't, the uncertainty is around the length of that. And that's uncertainty that we have to deal with as part of our risk assessment. But we can make sort of best guesses and make varying assumptions and model that and sort of say, well, worst case, is this, middle case is this, and best case is this. And that's sort of almost like assessing the risk appetite, if you like. But then the idea that, you know, we don't have to go and retrench people en masse, because if it is temporal, and that's the assumption we're basing our strategy on, then we're going to need them back again. They need to keep surviving. So what are the mechanisms and the levers that we have available to us? So again, looking at what have we got that we can use in this time, as opposed to what we've lost or what we haven't got. And that was annual leave and extensions and subsidies and negotiations with the government, etc.
What are some of the things that Qantas have done, Lee, that Joyce has announced that have sort of impressed you around dealing with that issue of staffing and so on?
Well, the fact that they just went straight into negotiations with, they identified very, very quickly areas that were going to see opportunity emerge for where there's going to be pressure in those areas, and there's going to be high demand for employment when we are shifting from dealing with a normal day-to-day life to, you know, a crisis that we're managing. So where are those resources being shifted? And so the negotiation with Coles and Woolworths to sort of place those people, I thought that they acted on that, you know, super quick. The fact that the board and the executive just cut their salaries to zero, you know, no discussion, no 20%, no 30%, no, you know, protracted debate at board level about what it should and shouldn't be, just bang. And more importantly, the view that when we come out of this to rebuild it, this is going to be an important operational piece of infrastructure this country has to rebuild the economy. And that message to me goes to every business. The more businesses that we can put into the best hibernation and cotton wool them and sort of, you know, keep the lights on, at least, as we use in the tech industry all the time, you know, keeping the lights on. And in startup world, a lot of it is keeping the lights on. And you know, and what are some of those bootstrapping, you know, cliched bootstrapping techniques that people use? There's no doubt it's challenging, but I think that out of that, sort of, we can start to take some lessons from leaders like Alan Joyce and say, okay, here's a completely different way to look at it, think about it. And that happens, that's the strategy and risk at the board level with a board hat on.
Yeah, it's always worried me that we kind of have a binary view of employment in tough times. You're either employed or you're laid off, sort of one or the other.
Yeah.
It strikes me that when you have these kind of crises, you know, there's no doubt in anyone's mind that at some stage the airline industry will have to reopen. And as you say, Australia being, you know, out on a limb somewhat geographically, its mainstay is being connected to the world, and air travel is going to be a vital infrastructural component of that in the economic recovery. So just to dig into that a little, can you talk a little bit about what Qantas have done with their employees rather than laying them off? Like what are the other tactics that Qantas have used that perhaps others could think about?
Well, look, as far as I know, and you know, I've read a bit on the detail, but letting people use annual leave, giving extended annual leave, changing up some of the policies around annual leave and when people can accrue them and can't, just sort of cutting some of that red tape around that to make it easy for employees to access that and to give them some runway, you know, because I think that's a really important thing is at the moment is what we're really trying to understand is runway. How much runway have we got in this time to continue to function and operate?
Yeah, at the personal level, at the company level, at the household level, you know, maximize the runway to get through what is hopefully a temporary, well, what is a temporary crisis, you know, that sort of obviously the approach. Let's swing back to FireTech for a moment. You know, I guess the one thing that the US and Australia do not need coming out of or in the midst of a pandemic crisis like this is another bushfire season like we had over Black Summer. We're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time, aren't we? Because the role of the emergency response sector is obviously to make sure that, you know, in the midst of this crisis, we're also not facing down, you know, another epic sort of firestorm, which we seem to almost forget happened over, you know, the last few months of last year and obviously the beginning of this year. So just switching our minds to that, you know, it's perhaps doubly important for companies working in the fire tech sector who can make a contribution to bushfire resilience to stay in business, to see this out. Viruses don't care about bushfires and vice versa. You know, we cannot afford to have another bushfire crisis on our hands, and we've got to do what we can to stay in business and contribute to that bushfire response effort over the next probably 6, 12 and years going ahead, don't we?
We absolutely, we do. And, you know, again, I think it actually forces you to think about things differently, you know, with the fire tech example, where you're looking at any industry for that matter, but, you know, we're specifically talking about the fire tech industry, is where you've got technologies that are out there that are, you know, bootstrapping, struggling to survive, trying to get their first customers. And you've got the other side of it is the people that are actually buying those technologies. And, you know, I mean, how does all of this affect the money flowing into that? And how do you make sure that you protect? It's not like you, as you say, we've got to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can't just go, okay, we're dealing with this at the moment, so let's forget this. There's other things that life sort of does go on in that regard, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, just sort of modeling it out a little, you're going to have lots of people confined to their residences and so forth, in isolation and so on. Really, the last thing you need is to be dealing with you know, major sort of bushfire challenges as we've had previously that threaten homes and lives and so forth, on top of you know, huge unemployment and so forth. So that's clearly remains a strategic priority, and I think our view of it is that you know, governments and emergency response agencies will not lose sight of the fact that that is you know, that is something that we absolutely have to be on guard about. And I suppose our job from the fire tech program perspective is to do what we can to accelerate and assist entrepreneurial people who are working on exciting and promising technologies in this space, get them to market as quickly as possible to contribute to that effort. Why don't you tell us a little about, you know, how you look at the fire tech program, what sort of perhaps the key objectives of it are in your mind?
Well, it's interesting. Like most people, the last couple of weeks has been interesting for us. So, you know, and the concept has evolved, but really we looked at two sides of the market, the buy side and the sell side of the market, and trying to identify where were the gaps, where were the barriers, how do we create more of a frictionless market, how do we connect these people that are working on interesting technologies that have some synergies, some opportunities to collaborate together. So it was sort of a very holistic approach, but it was taken from the view of meetups and physical spaces and getting people together. And it was, you know, a couple of weeks ago, we decided that perhaps that wasn't going to be the way the delivery was going to work in, you know, certainly the next 6 months. So we moved to how do we deliver that at a scale and more in an online, in a new world, in a, you know, I guess the new norm, if you like, and doing that through building community and making available things within that platform that can do both, help assist connect the buy side with the sell side and help connect those companies that are interested in particular areas broken down into categories and areas of focus and start building a community around that.
Right. So sort of looking at both sides, the problem of how are companies best equipped commercially to sell into that market. It's a complex market. We're talking about customers are typically in the sort of emergency response agency, quasi-governmental organizations, and so forth. It's what you might call a complex sale. And then on the other side, an industry that is needing to be more dynamic and faster moving as the scale and sort of regularity of these crises is growing. You know, agility has become so important. So you sort of see it as focusing on developing capability on both sides of that equation.
Definitely, and I think on the company side, there's also you know, regulatory environment. You know, with certain technologies where the technologies are ahead of the regulation. You know, so there's catch up in that, and in other areas there's regulations around certain areas that these technologies, because they're dealing, I suppose, in a lot of respects with technologies from a government procurement perspective. That, you know, we talked about risk earlier on. They're risk adverse. They're not naturally going to take a chance on a relatively unproven technology that has very few or no customers, and then say, you know, let's roll this out as a test pilot for a crisis emergency live situation. So it's almost like some of these technologies need to go through those, similarly to the pharmaceutical industry, like a human trials and clinical trials and things like that first. And that in itself can be a protracted, painful process over a long period of time, and that's challenging. So how do you sort of help bring those companies to that level of standard that would automatically, when there's a tender come forward, that they have, you know, met part of or some of that criteria, or are at least then able to navigate that environment a lot better?
What do you see as some of those capabilities that we can help promising technology companies with in terms of rapidly developing and maturing their commercial, let's say, toolbox and ability to execute on complex sales?
So specifically the complex sales, understanding the procurement cycles. Is that the question?
Well, in general terms, you know, what are some of the kind of key capability areas that you're thinking about that, you know, the program will seek to help promising companies with? Obviously, complex sales, the process of sales is one of them, but are there others that you're thinking about developing beyond just the sales bit?
Well, I think it's in a complex sale, sales and marketing need to be very aligned, and in complex sales, you need to apply sophisticated sales and marketing techniques to those. And it's not, you know, sort of the old school sales I came from was pick up the phone and, you know, hammer away on the phone and cold call and whatever else. But now we're very focused on, you know, from both sales and marketing perspective, ROI, multiple touch points, key messages, in breaking down into personas. It just becomes it becomes a science, but it can also become a little bit of analysis paralysis. So I think you've got to draw a fine line there. But really looking at a complex sale in the life cycle of the sale, from a funnel perspective, if you like, and looking at the sales cycle and breaking it down into the stages that it may be at, and at what point there should be information delivered to them at that point, or whether there should be another contact point. And so what does that whole life cycle look like from a lead management, an opportunity pipeline management, and then an account management and an ongoing relationship with a new customer?
You know, you talked about strategy and risk earlier. What are some of the things around strategy and risk that a participating FireTech business can expect to gain in terms of capabilities by participating in a program like this? How do you see the strategy and risk elements beyond the complex sale playing into this, and how do you plan to address that?
Well, I guess my view is that we've heard a lot about execution is everything. Execute, execute, execute. T-shirts with execution is everything. I get it. Execution is super, super important. But my message is that you can execute the wrong thing. And you can execute the wrong thing very fast, and you can burn a lot of money executing the wrong thing. And it can be very difficult to slow down when you need to turn. So you've got to be pretty ready once you put your foot on the gas, that you're confident as you can be. You're never always going to be 100%. But you know, how hard and fast do you go? And thinking about you know, the risks associated with managing the downside. So if I have to pull this up quickly, what does that look like? What am I exposed to? And thinking about the strategy and a framework of the three things we talked about before. What's the strategic risk? What's the financial risk we're exposed to? And what's the operational risk? And a framework around thinking about those types of risk. And I think also looking at it from risk is not a dirty word. Risk is not a bad thing. It's how can you mitigate risk? How can you manage risk? How can you start to have a framework to think about risk and assess the risk? And also setting what your risk threshold is as a company. You know, how much of a punt are you prepared to take? And that's why I say the strategy and the risk really work hand in hand, because if the strategy is high risk and you've got a low risk appetite set across the organization, it's maybe not the right strategy for you.
Are you thinking about this sort of in a modular approach about how the fire tech capability, commercial capabilities will be delivered? What's the sort of, you know, how are you thinking about, from a delivery perspective, helping promising companies develop those capabilities really rapidly or enhance the capabilities that they have?
I mean, it's a really interesting question because, as you know, the last couple of weeks has changed pretty dramatically about, and interestingly, once, you know, we started to move to, okay, what's another delivery method? Still, the outcome hasn't changed. The objectives haven't changed. It's just how we are going to go about delivering that. And the more that you know, certainly I've explored the opportunities there and the technologies that are available and the platforms that are there ready to plug and play and sign up and free access to cloud systems and all sorts of enterprise apps, etc. It actually opens up this sort of, you know, wonderful world of discovery and invention. You know, what can you do with this stuff? And there's things that are really easily, quickly, rapidly deployed, and then it opens up all sorts of ways of how you can deliver this. So, you know, when you think about the physical bounds of, if it's a classroom environment, we're bringing them all there. We've got the logistics, we've got the people in the room. It's how do you structure that? Completely different to more of an ad hoc, you know, consume as you go at your own pace. Here's the key sections, break it down into more micro modules so it becomes more snackable. All these things become available to you now when you start thinking about how you're going to pivot into a new delivery method. So there's a live use case.
Mm. Yeah, so yeah, sales sound like a key area of focus. Marketing, of course, which I know you view as being bundled together. Strategy. What about on the finance side? Is that something that you're planning to dig into a little?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's not to be an accountant. I'm not an accountant. I suppose I got dragged kicking and screaming into the world of finance through necessity, because I got to a certain point in my career where I just realized that if I didn't get my head around this stuff, I wasn't going to survive for very long. But I think really at a high level, just really trying to understand, you know, some really simple key ratios that you can do around your balance sheet, your P&L and your cash flow. Really simple ratios that you can do that can be your key performance indicators around, you know, where you are in terms of your financial health. It's probably no more than that in that regard. So it's not to and part of that is also helping build models, so modeling, so that we can start to understand what are the key levers in my revenue model or my P&L. So, what are the variables? What are the fixed? How can I create a model so that when I can start to, in times like this, go to my model and say, okay, if 50% of my revenue declines, bang, change that one parameter and it extrapolates the model for you. And then you are in real time looking at where you would be in that situation. And as you reassess over, in a case like this, on a daily, it's a day-to-day proposition, a week-to-week proposition, we're reassessing, okay, we've changed our strategy. Now where are we and what's the current situation? So that part of that, being able to build financial modeling. And then from the investment perspective, it's more about the gap I see all the time is the focus is on getting people prepared to pitch to raise capital, go out and raise capital. Where I see the gap in the knowledge and understanding is what's the right. I see capital as a continuum. Capital isn't a one-off thing. I jokingly say I started capitalizing my first business by, getting gold coins down from the back of the couch. That was raising capital to fund my first venture. And then it was credit cards or personal loans or family and friends or bigger capital, venture capital, all sorts of things, debt instruments. So it's more around that. What are the instruments available? When are the times? What's the impact on that? What's the impact on cap tables? The number one question I get asked is, if I bring this person at this percentage, what does all that look like? How do I get my head around 5 years down the track when I've now raised $30 million? What, am I going to end up with 1% or 5%? The time to work that out is now, not then. And so it's really focusing on helping in that area from a finance perspective.
Often I find we ask founders what their sort of biggest challenge is, and they'll quite a few of them will say access to capital. But I think often we dig in a little into that issue, and we find that that's perhaps more a symptom than a problem. The problems are more likely, a sales and marketing problem or a product market fit problem or something like that. If you've got a strong enough proposition and you've got good networks and you're not in a situation where capital has entirely dried up, you generally will find your way to capital. So, I suppose it would be interesting to dig in a little with you, the comparison between the FireTech program and a typical sort of accelerator type program. Can you do a little bit of a sort of, if you like, a side-by-side comparison for us on how you see the FireTech program, its sort of end objective versus, say, a typical accelerator program, and perhaps why you're wanting to structure FireTech the way you are.
Yeah, okay. So that I think there's a lot of things that feed into the thinking on that. A lot of the accelerator programs, I've been exposed to have been very focused around, I suppose, cookie cutter. And also output is, have PitchBook go pitch investors, have demo days, let's all make a noise about it and then worry about it again next year. So I think the continuity is a problem. Capability development is a lifetime thing. So you never actually do stop learning, and peer-to-peer learning, I think, is a fantastic way. Part of my inspiration with Beach City was based on a peer-to-peer learning thinking. How would it be if we could get all these people and share all of their knowledge, and untap that? So I think that idea of creating more than just a program, but an ongoing resource that builds over time through community through community feedback, through contributors, and really try to create some cohesion and sort of fluid networks, I think, is the three things I always sort of look at from an ecosystem development. And I hate that sort of term in a way because it's just lost its currency and it's so overused. But essentially, that's the best way to describe it, I guess. Is how do we, from an Australian perspective, create paths to scale? That's number one. How do we open up networks and create opportunities and paths to scales and connections in other countries? Because Australia's a great market to test, but it's not a scalable market. We're 25 million people. So path to scale is an important thing. And then how do we sort of connect the networks and create networks of people? And then how do we build capability? And I think that a lot of the focus has been on the idea that, we open a building. Better than anybody, the building is a building. It's the people and the programs that make the difference. So, trying to bring together the best people and creating paths to scale, and then building capability and building a resource on an ongoing basis that keeps growing as a continuum rather than a shot in the arm.
It seems like a lot of us are trying to figure out how to take business support into, I suppose, the future very rapidly, are realizing the sort of deep value of building digital networks. And it sounds to me like Firetech's approach now really has a sort of network centrality to it, doesn't it? Where it is the network and connecting people and connecting them to each other, connecting them to others that can contribute to their success. It sounds like that's really the central tenet of the Firetech program going forward. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the different kinds of connections that you foresee coming out of the program? Obviously connections to the program leaders, but then what are the other kinds of connections that you can see coming through the program?
Well, I mean, just in the early days, in the last month or so, I've personally had conversations with people within universities, people within state governments, federal governments, people within the sector, the emergency services, companies that are working on all sorts of technology. And I think in almost every one of those conversations, I could have thought, hey, that person could meet that person because they're doing some interesting stuff together. So there's people in University of San Diego working on things perhaps that a person over here doesn't even know exists, trying to solve a similar problem. So the idea that we could connect those and create that collaboration and then fast track that, instead of taking 12 months, it takes 3 months or 4 months or whatever that may be. So I think that'd be a fantastic type of outcome. And that's what happens in these types of environments. And, typically, as you know, Chris, we've relied on these big conferences. We've seen a rise in the big conferences over the last 5 years. And I was looking at some numbers a few months back, and I was saying the reason is because it's sort of the way that we're decentralizing and we are communicating like this. And then these become our big herd gatherings where we actually do the social stuff. So all of a sudden we've now got that removed. And it sort of, like, again, forces you to start thinking about how can you do that and still create this amazing network. And you look at the examples of, Facebook and all the social media platforms, the way the network effect works there. But I think probably more importantly, bringing together, for example, aggregating tenders. If you're in that space and you're looking for tenders that governments are putting out, where do I go to find them? Do I scour every tender site in every government in every world? So that's a challenge, but I think we're up for trying to solve that problem. If you're a company that's working in a specific area or topic of focus, what other companies are working in that area of focus, but also what other companies are working in areas of perhaps not satellite early detection, but another technology that's complementary, that becomes enabling, that creates a new innovation from those. And if you look at innovation, the way innovation has typically happened is it's the convergence of two pieces of technology that comes together that makes that real breakthrough innovation. So I think that if those types of things could come out of it, we'd have a pretty successful outcome.
In your most recent project, Beach City, you've built up a pretty amazing network by flitting around the world, going to a lot of conferences and connecting with sort of thought leaders and investors and so on. Are you planning to connect some of those people into this network so that you are able to deliver some of these capabilities alongside mentoring and other kinds of assistance that really top class kind of A players in technology, innovation and entrepreneurship and investing can bring? Is that part of your plan?
Well, I think it's another interesting question, because it's where we start to think about pivoting, and we start thinking about, okay, what's the innovation here? So, you know, Beach City's business was 100% reliant on sending crews to large-scale tech events, mainly in Asia, but also around the world, to interview interesting people and speakers and mentors, etc., and then build a sort of a repository of those people. And you know, in my mind, it served a number of purposes, but certainly helped build my network. But so, you know, you look at our business, we've essentially shut our business down from a media production perspective, because there aren't our events and all of our pipelines just cancelled or postponed. But then you flip to it and you say, okay, well, what have we got? Well, we've built a fairly decent sized audience, and we've built a fairly big network. You know, we've got assets within our databases and our communications. You know, we've created a channel, we've created a distribution channel. And so what are the things that we've got there that we can actually leverage and apply to somewhere else? So the answer to your long answer to your question is yes, absolutely. It's just a matter of how do you deploy those resources against that. But certainly, and even apply some of the learnings from, in terms of the content creation and the production and everything else, and then apply it to the FireTech opportunity.
Lee, tell us about timeframes on FireTech now. What are your thoughts on when people might be able to join the network and learn more, or contact us and find out more about what's on offer and whether it might be a fit for them? What's your thinking around timeframes and communication?
So look, I think you know, we're working pretty quickly. I think we're sort of, you know, in the closed beta at the moment. We've got a few people on. We're going to invite a few more people in. We've, you know, got a production schedule in place, and I think by the end of next week, we're really sort of hopefully to be in a position where we can open the network up and bring more people in. That's the aim of it. So, but again, I think it points to the overall conversation we're having, is that depending how you approach it and how you think about it, very quickly you can pivot from one strategy to another strategy, execute on that super quickly. And actually, I feel, Chris, that FireTech's in a much better place strategically for the longer term. And the change in the thinking and the, you know, the removing of that preconception of this is how it all works, and all of a sudden that's taken away from you, requires you to then push outside that boundary and go, all right, well, that's not an option anymore. Now what? And I think that door actually opened up more opportunities than it closed.
Very good. Well, listen, thanks so much for taking the time for a quick initial chat. Obviously, we'll be having lots more, and I think we're all looking forward to seeing you behind the microphone, interviewing and talking with some of the world's most interesting people operating in this space, investors, mentors, innovators, scientists, you know, people who really have deep expertise across the different fire problem spaces, well, bushfire and wildfire response problem spaces. So should be an exciting time.
I'm looking forward to it. And, you know, we've really got, what, 5 months up our sleeve, and we'll be heading back into our fire season. So let's hope it's a quiet one.
Absolutely.
All right, buddy.
All right, thanks so much.
Talking to you. Thanks, mate.
Talk soon.
Bye.
Cheers.